We're going to move on into our next discussion right now, which is between vision and reality, a conversation about the role of religious freedom in the Africa Union's quest for an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. For this interview, I'm very honored to be able to welcome our special guest, the Honorable Erastus J.O. Mwencha, Deputy Chairperson of the Africa Union. Thank you for coming all the way over here. We appreciate your insights. And so, much of the day that we've been discussing various strategies for engagement for international religious freedom, and we've been talking about the state of the world in religious freedom and how things appear to be getting worse. And some of the stories that we hear come from the continent of Africa, some of the activities from groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. My question for you, as someone who basically oversees or interacts with many of the countries there, are the stories we're hearing about Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, is there anything that's missing? Are we hearing them solely from the Western perspective? What can you share about that?
Well, thank you very much, Leslie, for having me. And I'm also honored to be here in front of this wonderful audience. I think the question of what is coming out of Africa and whether the media is giving one perspective has been answered in a way by Mr. Dion, who has just spoken here, when he said the media does what it does best, and that is to sell the news. And that which can sell is what gets out there. And so there's no question about the fact that Africa has been getting more than a fair share of its own really dark side. But that is not to say all is well. There are challenges, and the case you have given, particularly on Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, are troubling indeed. Here is the case for it. Boko Haram started in Nigeria, in a state known as Borno, northeast of Nigeria, in 2002. At that time, it was essentially a one Mr. Yusuf who saw an opportunity of starting some kind of college where he brought young people. And essentially, many of them who came to this college were from poor families. And he drew many of them from all over Nigeria and the surrounding states. Initially, of course, it was really trying to go back to basics, condemning the society and the state, that they have veered away from true religion, fundamentalism. Of course, you know, it mutated later on to set up a caliphate, and later on, of course, it ended up being the kind of war that has been there. Sadly, as we speak, over 2 million people have been displaced, 20,000 killed, and many more than we can say. The biggest story that you all know is the Chibok girls. What I see in this, and this is also relates with what you've just asked about Al-Shabaab, is poverty at the bottom line, and the easy prey of these young unemployed people that fell victim of this, very cunning way of luring them to this kind of activity. On the other hand, in the case of Al-Shabaab, as you know, that Somalia has been more or less like a failed state for a long time. In fact, since 1992. And in that vacuum, they had developed a group that wanted to bring what was known as, at that time, the Islamic courts. And of course, their approach, and of course, Somalia, as you know, is a country that is very much ethnic in orientation, clan-based. And this one has also evolved over time to try and topple the transitional government and establish links with others like Al-Qaeda and others. And so you can see what starts as a local issue very quickly evolves to become an international network of these criminal gangs. Coming from the African Union, it has been our challenge to try and push out Al-Shabaab. And as you know, as African Union, we have a force there, known as the African Mission to Somalia, AMISOM. And so what now Al-Shabaab has turned on to is not only to fight the local communities, but also the African Union. And now here is the question then you asked. Are we getting, the right angle of the story from the media?
Exactly, right.
Sometimes I wonder, because I have been to Somalia, I have been to Mogadishu, and life there is normal sometimes. I mean, you wonder. If you went to Somalia, you'd be amazed. Somalia is more advanced than some of the countries like DRC in terms of internet and the rest. But obviously, what comes out always is that story of a bombing that has taken place, that story of kidnapping that has taken place, and which is, of course, understandable. And for us, the media bringing this out is to remind us that there is a problem. But I can just summarize to say, as African Union, we are more or less really decapitated the Al-Shabaab. Now they number less than 7,000. They are in 2-3 places. And the problem is, even as you drive them out, they melt into society. And sooner or later, they will regroup unless something is done. So the bottom line is then, as I said earlier on, is whether you can sustain that peace. And the only way that you can sustain the peace in those areas is to bring about development, to engage these youth and ask them something to do.
So that leads into my next question, which is, there's a common motto in association with the African Union that says African solutions to African problems. In your opinion, what is the proposed solution to what appears to be sectarian violence? Is that what you're saying, that much of that violence is driven by poverty? So we need economic answers?
Let me start by saying what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean non-cooperation with international community. What it means is that Africa wants to take the charge, the lead in designing its agenda, and then getting international community to accompany Africa in implementing that agenda. The background to this is, if you think of Africa, a paradox, a very rich continent, but very poor people, has been open and implemented a number of programs that originated sometimes outside Africa. For example, in the 70s and the 80s, Africa faithfully implemented structural adjustment programs. Now, you know all that, what happened. I can also go to the example that we have given on peace and security. The models that we have seen sometimes come is Africa has always argued no amount of military power wins a war, because at the end of the day, you must coexist as a nation, as a society. And the models that we have seen sometimes applied was that of come, carpet pumping, and go away. And you know what happened in the case of Libya. And so Africa has been saying, it is not that you don't want to engage international community, but that international community should involve local leadership in designing the solution. And that is not only limited to Africa itself, because, for instance, in the case of Africa, we devolve. I mean, if you look at the UN Charter, it provides for regional mechanism. If you look at regional mechanism from African Union, we devolve it, for instance, in West Africa, we prefer to work with local communities. I could give you countless examples where you go to a community and you find the community at each other. But when you sit down and put those communities, they know the answer to that problem. And when you work with them, it is sustainable. And that is exactly the point that Africa is saying. And that's why we have come up with our agenda, for instance, what we now call the blueprint of our Agenda 2063. And we are saying, let the world come and join us in implementing what we own and what we aspire to achieve.
So in setting out to achieve these goals, is there a role for non-governmental organizations, NGOs, or the faith community in working with the African Union or specific countries?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, under the first of all, the African Union, our motto is that it is a union of the people, not governments. And there is a forum which is known as Economic and Social Council that brings in all other non-state actors. But beyond that also, there is a platform where private sector and government really come together to chart issues of concern. And even as religious communities, we have a program for interreligious community that is involved particularly in conflict solving and also in state management.
Have these programs worked well? Have you seen successes, or do you have to be careful with some of the groups who you allow to work?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think of the case like in the war in Mozambique, we had to use a combination of mediators, particularly from interreligious community. We have used it in the case of South Sudan, particularly fighting with Sudan itself. And so, yes, it has worked, but of course, the African Union, at the end of the day, you were saying, it is just barely about 15 years old. And so this is a process that is still in the making.
So for many of the individuals here in this room, many of us do work in various parts of Africa. What advice would you give to some of the groups here that are trying to do good in Africa? What would work and what wouldn't work? I mean, obviously a partnership, because you don't want someone coming in with their own agenda that's not in line with the needs of the country or the African Union.
Well, as I said earlier on, we encourage partnerships. And Africa, for example, has a partnership with the United States of America, has a partnership with European Union, has partnership with China, has partnership with Japan. And in all these partnerships, Africa's posture at the moment is we come with a blueprint of our own priorities, and we seek international community to assist us implement that agenda.
Well, Mr. Mwancha, obviously with religion in various countries in Africa, as obviously we've seen with what's happened with Boko Haram, again, we continue to talk about these issues. But what's your view of the general availability of religious freedom, and what are some of the things you've done from the African Union perspective to help solve problems where some have come up?
I think I'll take a few of lines from my next intervention. Africa is a very, could call it a religious continent, and you see the spread of religion throughout the continent very much prospering. And that is because also at the continent level, there is a convention that has been adopted that requires countries to provide in their constitution freedom of expression, freedom of choice, but also freedom to believe what they want to believe. I must add quickly here that not all countries have implemented this faithfully, but it is a project in the making, and we're pushing to make sure that countries adopt this convention and implement it. But also we see in many legislations a lot of effort to provide for this that is already underway.
Is there protection for people who choose not to believe at all?
That, unfortunately, we find it very silent in many. And in fact, I was listening to the presentation by Mr. Dion now, when he talked about those non-religious groups who don't find accommodation, because we all tend to think in terms of religious liberty as being really the preserve of the mainstream of what we might call Abrahamic religions or whatever, but does not provide for those who don't want to believe, and atheists and the rest. And that is a really struggle that you see not only in Africa, and I think is global.
So you've seen evidence there has been some persecution from in people in those communities then?
Yes, unfortunately. In far too many countries, we see that happening.
So as we're here in the United States, we're in the middle of a campaign season, and obviously there are a lot of domestic issues, but again, with international religious liberty, one of the things that we're trying to do here is raise the level of debate and to raise the importance of these issues. If you could give advice to the American candidates, what would you want them to know about religious liberty?
Well, that's a tough one, Adam. But I mean, someone has said that, you know, we campaign in we govern in prose, but campaign in poetry. And sometimes when you listen to campaign rhetoric, they can be very confusing. But here is what we take from those of us far from United States. United States has been a great model of defending and upholding the freedom of worship. And we believe this is what makes America unique. As a nation that has embraced diversity, as a nation that has also gone out to protect and defend those that need the space to believe and to worship. And we believe that United States should continue to play this role in bringing together like-minded countries, because we know that this is a job have done globally, and we need to continue to fight for this space. Now, as to what is happening in the United States, quite frankly, we have no mandate to vote here, to talk about United States politics. But as I said earlier on, we know that campaign rhetoric can be confusing. And that is the message that we get out there for those of us who are not living in the United States.
Well, especially when some of the rhetoric might involve countries within your area of influence. When you hear people debating about maybe things that they may not even know about, other than what they read in the media.
That's true. And the media has a way of bringing these things out. And let me say something that I should have mentioned when I talked about Boko Haram. You know, when this situation developed, the politicians jumped on it and made capital out of it. And here is our take, that politicians can see discontent in society and capitalize on it, not knowing the damage that this might cause down the road. And I say this with a lot of restraint, because I know in the days and the periods of unemployment. In the periods, like Mr. Dion was saying, when you have poverty, it is easy to take this disgruntlement and make capital out of it. And that is always the danger, that politicians can, if not tamed, create unintentionally. And that is sometimes our fear for those of us who are not in the field of politics.
And so for my last question, it again flows from that, because one of the things, for many people, the first time they heard about Boko Haram was with the kidnapping of the Chibok schoolgirls. And there was the media campaign, the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. And I'm just curious how that was seen. For many people, it was a good way to raise the level of knowledge and engagement. But I'm curious how that was viewed from the African Union's perspective. Did you think it was helpful, or did you have any opinions about it at all?
It was, but I think you need to understand the nature of the country before you then understand what this could have caused. Now, Nigeria is a country of diversity, ethnically, but also religiously. And Nigeria is a democratic state. Nigeria, having lived through military regimes, now is a democracy, and they've just gone through an election last year that you saw a sitting government removed. Capitalizing on the on misfortunes for capital, for political capital, can happen, and it happened during the time of campaign, and that was the challenge. But beyond that, I think that consciousness, which is now global, has raised the profile and forced even the sitting government, because the previous government was very much reluctant, because they were also now looking at politics of, they wanted not to be seen like it was a religious war. And so the government was indecisive. But now we're talking a situation where we have a government that is approaching this also in a very, I would call it, systematic way. And we have started to see results of it. 2 girls were rescued this week, although some of them came in conditions that are despicable. One of them came with a child. And it was heartening to see the president say, he's going to take this child back to school. I think we can start to see a nation healing. We can start to see a nation refocusing its energy away from what could have been potentially very divisive. And thank God Nigeria is back today. And we can see a strong Nigeria emerging out of this crisis.
Well, we appreciate your insights. It's not every day where we get to have someone with your stature to be able to give us a more realistic view or another perspective on some of these issues that many of us care about each and every day. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.